So let's pause now and think about deontological ethics in general and look at the pros and cons. And we're going to do this with all three of these approaches that we are considering here today. So what are the pros? What are the good things about deontological ethics? There are pros and there are cons. And what is good about this way? And here I'm talking about the broad sense of deontological ethics, all of these rule-based or principle-based approaches, not just Kant's approach, but quite generally, including things like the Ten Commandments and the honor code at the Naval Academy, anything that you thought of. What are the positives and the pros of that? And you may have some thoughts, but here are some that I think. First, I think that this idea of respect for others is deeply intuitive for us. I think that in our culture, in our society, we grow up with this, and it's there for us in a very deep-seated way that we perhaps don't articulate, but it's always there for us. So when we talk about rights, for example, in our society, that's really what's going on here. Rights are a deontological set of ethics, and we think we should respect other people's rights. If I'm respecting your right to freedom of speech, what am I doing? I'm respecting you as a rational agent. I'm respecting your freedom to choose for yourself what you will say. And so this is a deep-seated and very intuitive thing for us in our world, in our society. Secondly, another pro is that these sets of principles and rules very often represent what we might call the wisdom of the ages. We've got to these rules for a reason. And while deontological ethics is not really focused on the consequences, they often have come into being because of things that have happened in the past. We've learned from hard experience that we should always do this, and we should never do that. And so these rules are really often pretty good. Now, obviously, there's a great diversity of sets of rules, so some of them may not be very good, but the ones that are at the core of our society are really pretty well thought through and well entrenched. They're good, and so that's a pro. They work. And thirdly, what I want to illustrate and emphasize here is that deontological ethics gives you the opportunity to apply what psychologists call a Ulysses device. A Ulysses device refers, of course, to Greek mythology, to Ulysses or Odysseus, as he's also known in some versions. And the story, it's really referencing a story that it relates to the image on the screen. And so what happens is, if you may have seen the movie Troy, so think of that movie Troy, the end of the movie, think of what came next. And what came next was that Ulysses or Odysseus decided to go home. That's the obvious thing to do after a good battle. And normally the sailing time from Troy back to Ithaca, where he was from, should have been about 4 months. But in fact, it turned out to take about 10 years. And this is the story known as the Odyssey, those 10 years of him trying to make his way home. And all sorts of things happened along the way. GPS wasn't invented, so he got lost, and all sorts of terrible things happened. But the key event that we're focused on here is when Odysseus and his crew come to a point where they hear about these creatures called sirens. I'm sure they're familiar to you. Sirens were obviously mythical creatures, but real in his world. And sirens were these creatures who had this distinguishing characteristic of being able to sing in this most incredible way. It's just absolutely the most exquisite thing you could possibly experience would be to hear a siren sing. And so Odysseus, his ears pricked up. He's a kind of an experienced guy, a bit of an adrenaline junkie. He likes to have different experiences. He's thinking, well, that'd be great. I'd love to hear the sirens sing. But there's a catch. The problem is, when you sail past where the sirens live and you hear them sing, they essentially mesmerize you. You become hypnotized by this sound and you get drawn towards it. And what happens for sailors is they get drawn in towards where the sirens are. And of course, they're on the rocks. And so you sail your ship into the rocks and eventually everybody dies. Not such a good outcome. And so Odysseus hears about this, so he comes up with a cunning plan. And his plan is this. He says, I will have all my crew put wax in their ears so that they can't hear anything. They can't hear the siren's call, so they won't be affected by it. And then I'll have them tie me to the mast. So I'll be able to hear them, but even if I become hypnotized by this sound, I won't be able to run around on deck and steer the ship into the rocks because I'll be tied to the mast. So it's a bit of a long-winded story, but the point is that what psychologists call a Ulysses device or an Odysseus device is a way to, in advance of some challenging situation, to tie yourself to the mast, to lock yourself into a situation, into a set of behaviors, such that when troubles come, when temptations come, you'll stick to your principles. And deontological ethics is really all about that. We decide in advance, when we're clear-headed, when we're not under pressure, when we're not facing temptations, that these are the things that we will do and these are the things that we will not do. So that when the moment comes and we have the siren call of self-interest, we won't find ourselves drawn onto the rocks of ethical failure. And I'll talk about self-interest later, but that really is one of the biggest challenges to ethics. It's not that it's often not the case that it's particularly hard to know what the right thing to do is. It's rather it's hard to do the right thing. And that's really because we are essentially self-interested beings. And doing the ethical thing is, at least in the short term, sometimes against our self-interest. And so that's one of the challenges we face. Deontological ethics gives us a way to tie ourselves to the mast so that we can resist that particular challenge. But there are cons. And so let's think about what some of the downsides are to deontological ethics. Firstly, there is obviously the problem that these kinds of sets of rules can be inflexible. So let's imagine a scenario. We take Immanuel Kant out of his original time frame. We bring him in some decades forward into the 1930s or 1940s in Nazi Germany. We put Kant in a house in Nazi Germany, and he's in that house, and he realizes that also in the house are a family of Jews who are hiding and sheltering from the Nazis. So he's in that house, bang, 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 there's a knock at the door, and it's the SS, and they're like, "Good morning, Mr. Kant. Are you sheltering any Jews in this house?" Now remember his rule. His rule is never lie. Lying is always the wrong thing to do. But clearly we think that the right thing to do in that situation is to lie. That's obviously the right thing to do. And so this would be an example of where the rule is too inflexible to the situation. And that's a challenge sometimes with deontological ethics. And related to that is, of course, the problem that deontological ethics doesn't consider the consequences. And that's exactly part of the problem with that scenario I just gave you, that rather ridiculous fictional scenario with Immanuel Kant. His applying the rule doesn't take into consideration what the consequences will be for him not lying. And yet that seems to us to be very important. So deontological ethics often generally don't focus on consequences, but we do think that they matter. So that's a downside, that's a con. So think about the way these rules work. They're usually about responsibilities that individuals have to one another. So if I make a promise to you, I have a responsibility to live up to that promise to you. But it says nothing about what should happen or what might happen as a result of me living up to that. Finally, there's the challenge that sometimes deontological principles might clash. It doesn't happen very often, but particularly if we are bound by two or more different sets of deontological rules, we might find ourselves in a situation where one set says we should do this and the other set says we should do that, and there's no clear way to reconcile those or to work out what the right thing to do is. So let's illustrate this by going back to the scenario I asked you to consider earlier, the transplant surgeon. In this case, though, it's not you that's the surgeon. In this case, it's Dr. Immanuel Kant. What would he think is the right thing to do in this situation? Well, clearly, what's problematic about this scenario is that the husband of the wife, remember, she's having the transplant, but she's not telling her husband, who she's getting a kidney from, that she intends to divorce him. Well, the problem with that situation is that the husband doesn't have all the information he needs in order to make a rational choice. In other words, his capacity for reason is being circumvented. He is being used as a mere means to an end, as Kant would put it. And that's ethically problematic. And so Immanuel Kant, I think, would speak up. At one level, he would say, the right thing for me to do is to tell the husband what's going on, so that he may exercise his critical reason, so that he may be a rational agent. And that's what respecting him means. But there is another wrinkle to this scenario, because remember, he's not just Immanuel Kant, he's Dr. Immanuel Kant, the surgeon. And as a surgeon, he has particular responsibilities that are ethical responsibilities tied to the nature of his profession. So it may be that he would conclude that his responsibility of medical in confidence, of respecting the confidentiality of his patient, means he can't speak up. And so perhaps he's in a situation where he's got two sets of ethical principles that clash, and that may be a problem for him. So that is deontological ethics, or as I've called it, constraints, the first main approach to ethics that we have in our society. We move on now to considering the second main approach to ethics that is generally applied in our society, and this is really quite simple to understand. And it's the second C in the three C's we're considering is consequences. And most of us do this very intuitively. We come across some situation where it's difficult to know what the right thing to do is. Our natural inclination is to go, well, which course of action is going to result in the best consequences? And that, from a philosophical perspective, is a viewpoint associated with this gentleman. This is Jeremy Bentham. He's known as the father of utilitarianism, which is the philosophical approach, the dominant philosophical approach that uses consequences as the main way to decide what the right thing to do is. And again, Bentham is a little bit like Immanuel Kant in that he's doing his thinking in a time, in Britain in his case, where the dominant worldview is starting to lose its grip to some degree. Again, that was Christianity, and he is himself very much an atheist, and so he's looking for a way to ground ethics. What can I base ethics on if I'm not reaching for God or God's will or God's commands as the way to work out what the right thing to do is? And he thinks the answer is about consequences. I should do what's going to result in the best consequences. And so this is a pretty well-known phrase. He comes up with this idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. What should I do in any situation? I should choose the course of action that's going to result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people affected by my action. Now, there were a few wrinkles to this. So yes, happiness was one version, but the utilitarians, as they thought about it, realized that some people are only happy if they're unhappy, so that didn't work particularly well. Really, initially, they were thinking around in terms of pain. So, you know, they were thinking, well, obviously, everybody likes pleasure and nobody likes pain. Oh, okay, some people do like pain, so that didn't work for them. And so they came up with this much more abstract idea of what they called utility. And utility is whatever it is for you that you value. And different things will give different people utility. Think of music. Some people get utility out of listening to opera. Other people get utility out of listening to death metal. Some people even get utility out of listening to K-pop, though I can't possibly understand that. But the point is, as Bentham put it, it doesn't matter. What we're after is whatever will give people utility, and we should act in a way that will maximize that in terms of everybody who's affected. So that's consequentialist ethics and utilitarianism, which is the dominant approach to utilitarianism. So what are the pros and cons of this approach? And there are some positives, there are definitely some pros to this, just as there were with deontological ethics. Now, obviously, I've already mentioned this. There is this intuitive appeal of looking to consequences as the first way to consider what to do when it's difficult to know what to do. We're drawn to that. That's natural for us, and that really does make sense because this is a fundamental idea in our society. So as a liberal democracy, what is a liberal democracy all about? It's about maximizing space for people to choose for themselves what their version of the good life, the meaningful life, the worthwhile life is. Within, obviously, some boundaries that we don't hurt each other, but that's what a liberal democratic state is about. And that really is underpinned by this utilitarian idea of maximizing utility. that's what we're there for. And so it's strongly intuitive for us. It makes a lot of sense to us. It's also very simple to understand. I don't even need to remember 10 commandments, which is not very many. I just need to remember one thing. I should do what's going to lead to the greatest utility for the greatest number of people affected. Very simple to understand. So that's a positive. Also important is that everybody counts the same. That can be quite challenging. It can mean that we take second place, right? My utility is just one data point in the calculation of all the people who are affected by this. But again, that makes sense. Again, that connects with our democratic ideal that we should all count the same. And so that's a positive, again, of correction of consequentialist ethics. But there are some cons. There are some downsides. So what are those? Well, sometimes we might find that taking a consequentialist approach leads us to problematic results. And so let's again use a rather ridiculous example. But think of, since I'm using the Nazis, let's think of Hitler in the 1930s. Let's imagine that Hitler was a convinced utilitarian. He thought this is exactly the way to work out what the right thing to do is. And so he decides to put together a survey form that he gets sent out to every German in Germany. And that survey form says this: well, firstly, if you are a Jew, complete section A. If you are not a Jew, complete section B. And so it asks this. If you're a Jew, section A says, as a Jew, how unhappy would being exterminated make you? On a scale to 1 to 10. And I think we can pretty much assume that everyone would put a 10. Every Jewish person would have put a 10 on that scale. But then if you're not a Jew, you answer section B, and perhaps it says something like this: how much happier would you be if there were no Jews left in Germany, if we exterminated them all? And a scale to 1 to 10. So let's imagine that Hitler sends these out, he gets all his results in, he tallies up the numbers, and while most people maybe don't put a 10 for exterminating the Jews, maybe at that time there was a lot of anti-Semitism, maybe they marked off a 2 or a 3 or 4, and he does the numbers, and overall there is going to be more happiness or more utility by exterminating the Jews than not exterminating them. So he thinks that's the right thing to do. Now, that is obviously an absurd example, but it's trying to illustrate the problem with this approach, with this consequences-based approach, with this utilitarian approach, in that there's no sense of anything in there that makes some things just wrong regardless of whether most people would be made happier or get more utility from it. And yet we think that that's true. Of course it's wrong to murder people, regardless of whether other people are made happy by that. That's the wrong thing to do. And so sometimes we get problematic results, and we get what we sometimes call the problem of the few. That as we're calculating the greatest utility for the greatest number, there are some people who don't get utility. And initially, Bentham had an additional principle. His idea was that we should act on a principle that creates the greatest utility for the greatest number, but also anything we do must benefit everybody affected. But that's impossible. So some people are not going to be benefited. Some of them may get a lot of disutility out of your choice. But if they're outweighed, that seems to still make it okay. But then we leave out justice. And justice seems very important, even though sometimes the majority of people would accept a position that was unjust. And so that's a challenge or a con. Then, of course, there is the challenge of predicting consequences. Now, we're reasonably good at predicting consequences in the first order effects, but consequences go on. And so what happens in the second and third and fourth order case? Well, we often just don't know. It's very hard to calculate. And this is made even harder by the fact that we are inherently biased in the way we think about consequences. So we are naturally self-interested. That's rational for us. It has all sorts of value for us. We survive because we are self-interested. But that natural self-interest tends to affect our calculations of consequences. There have been a number of studies which show that we naturally tend to predict the thing to happen which best aligns with our self-interest. And that's not us being disingenuous, that's our fundamental nature. And so we're not great at predicting consequences, which is obviously problematic for an approach that rests heavily on that. And finally, there is the challenge of weighing outcomes. It's all very well to say we're going to weigh up utility, but how do we weigh different kinds of utility for different kinds of people? Let me give you a very simple example. Imagine you're driving down the road with two other people in the car. The one person in the car says, hey, let's hurry up. Let's get to the lookout point. It's going to be a spectacular sunset. I want to take some photos. The other person in the car says, no, actually, I really would love a beer. Can we stop at the bar and grab a beer? And you're agnostic about those two. You figure either would be fine. How do you decide then? How do you decide how much utility your first passenger is going to get from watching a sunset versus how much utility your other passenger is going to get from stopping for a beer? It's very, very hard to do. And that's a very simple example. So weighing outcomes can be very tricky. So let's go back to our transplant scenario again and use this to illustrate the consequentialist approach to ethics. In this case, then the doctor is not Immanuel Kant, it's not you, it's Dr. Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism. So what does he do? Well, it seems pretty straightforward. He weighs up the potential consequences of speaking up, which would perhaps be that his patient wouldn't receive a kidney and could die. He weighs that against the feelings that the husband will have of being betrayed and the husband's situation of losing a kidney where he perhaps wouldn't otherwise, weighs those two things against each other. Seems pretty straightforward. You just keep quiet and you do the operation because the greatest utility will come out of that situation. But as we've said, there are problems with those kinds of calculations. It's a bit self-interested, isn't it? It's self-interest for the surgeon in going ahead because he's going to get paid for it. So that's part of potentially the situation. Maybe this is skewing his way of thinking about this. But there's also the problem of second and third order effects. How do we know what will happen after this? Will the husband perhaps be so devastated by what's gone on that he kills himself? In that case, it's a much worse overall situation. Even though you've got one life saved and one life lost, it's still worse than not giving her the kidney because perhaps she's now devastated and racked with guilt by what she did. Maybe she will kill herself. You just don't know. And so there's this challenge of predicting what the consequences will be down the line. We come now to the third main approach to ethics that we find broadly in our society. That is the approach that focuses on character. And certainly this is very familiar in the military context. We talk a lot about character in the military, and that makes a lot of sense. So what can we learn about this approach? From a philosophical perspective, it's what we call virtue ethics. And this is by far the oldest philosophical approach to ethics that we have available to us today, that still has influence on us today. So if we think about Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham, we're going back a few hundred years. Here, we're going really back to the ancient Greeks. We're talking about people like Aristotle. He's a key figure in all of this. So you're going back thousands of years. So it's a much, much older and in many ways a deep and rich tradition of ethics. And there are different versions of virtue ethics. There are different systems of virtue ethics. I mentioned Aristotle. His is the approach that we tend to focus on. That's the dominant approach. But if you've ever heard of the idea of Stoicism, that's another kind of virtue ethics. And there are also some contemporary versions. For example, there's a thing called the ethics of care, which is a virtue ethic that comes out of feminist thought that is gaining increasing influence within the medical world. So there are a number of different kinds of virtue ethics, but they share these common points.